The military dictatorship had taken control nearly a decade earlier, in 1964. But by 73, they had tightened their grip like a vice. The so-called años de chumbo, the years of lead, were in full swing. Anyone who dared to speak against the regime simply disappeared. Students, journalists, teachers, workers, they vanished into the night, swallowed by a system that left no traces. The official story: they never existed, but in the shadows, resistance was growing. While cities grew under constant surveillance, with informants on every corner and fear hanging in the air like humidity, something extraordinary was happening deep in the Amazon rainforest. A silent war was being fought in a place so remote that most Brazilians had never even heard its name: the Araguaia region. A vast expanse of jungle where the Araguaia River cuts through the heart of Brazil like a lifeline. It was here that the Communist Party of Brazil, the PCdoB, had decided to make their stand against nearly a decade of military rule. They called it the Guerrilla do Araguaia, the Araguaia Guerrilla. It was more than just an armed movement. It was hope itself, taking root in the deepest, darkest corners of the forest. Young revolutionaries, many barely out of their teens, left everything behind to fight for a dream of freedom. Among them was a woman whose story would remain buried for decades. Her name was Walkíria Afonso Costa, a 28-year-old former pedagogy student from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And in 1973, she walked into that jungle and never came back. But this isn't just another story of political violence. It's the story of how one woman's courage echoed through time, until finally, the truth could no longer stay buried in the Amazon soil. This is the story of Walk, as she was known to her comrades, the last guerrilla fighter to be captured in what would become one of Brazil's most tragic chapters. Her smile could light up a classroom. That's what everyone remembered about Walkíria Afonso Costa, a young pedagogy student with dreams bigger than the small towns where she would have taught, bigger than the limited future that society had mapped out for women in those days. Born in the early 1940s, Walkíria grew up in a Brazil that was changing rapidly. Cities were expanding, universities were opening their doors to more students, and young people were beginning to question everything their parents had accepted as normal. She was part of a generation that refused to stay silent. At the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Walkíria wasn't just studying education, she was becoming an activist. She served as vice president of her academic center, organizing student meetings, participating in protests, and speaking out against inequality. In those days, that was almost revolutionary in itself. Her professors remember her as passionate, determined, someone who couldn't stand injustice. When she saw poor children without shoes, without food, without hope, something inside her burned. When she witnessed the inequality that surrounded her daily life, she couldn't just look away and pretend everything was fine. The military dictatorship had made it clear that students, teachers, and intellectuals were dangerous. They were the ones spreading subversive ideas. They were the ones who might inspire others to resist. And Walkíria? She was exactly the kind of person they feared most. But fear worked both ways. While the regime feared people like her, Walkíria feared something else entirely. She feared that if she didn't act, if she didn't resist, she would be complicit in the suffering around her. For Walkíria, resistance wasn't just a political choice. It was a moral imperative. Walkíria believed that to resist was the only way to dream of freedom, her family would later recall, tears in their eyes as they spoke about the young woman who had once filled their house with laughter and revolutionary songs. Her fellow students at UFMG remember her infectious enthusiasm for learning, her belief that education could change lives, and her unwavering conviction that everyone deserved dignity and respect. She saw teaching not just as a profession, but as a form of activism. So she made a decision that would change everything. She would leave behind her studies, her family, her comfortable life, and join the armed resistance in the Amazon jungle. She would become Walk, a guerrilla fighter in humanity's oldest classroom, the forest itself. Imagine waking up before dawn, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the symphony of the Amazon forest. Howler monkeys calling from treetops, hundreds of feet above. The rustle of leaves as nocturnal creatures return to their hiding places. And somewhere in the distance, always in the distance, the sound you never wanted to hear. Helicopters. This was life in the Araguaia jungle for the guerrilla fighters. Every day was a careful balance between survival and revolution, between hope and terror. They lived like ghosts in a green world that could kill them as easily as protect them. Walkíria adapted to this life with a determination that amazed even the most experienced fighters. The young student who once wore clean clothes and comfortable shoes now wore military boots caked with mud and clothes that hadn't been properly washed in weeks. But her spirit? That remained unbroken. The routine was brutal and relentless. Before the sun rose, they would pack their few possessions and begin marching through terrain that could swallow you whole. Dense vegetation that tore at your clothes and skin. Rivers that had to be crossed with weapons held above your head. Insects that bit and stung without mercy. Food was always scarce. Sometimes they would go days eating nothing but wild fruits and whatever small animals they could catch. Clean water was a luxury. Medicine was almost non-existent. And always, they had to move silently, leaving no trace of their passage. But Walkíria never complained. Fellow guerrilla fighters remember her as someone who lifted spirits when hope seemed lost. When younger fighters would break down from exhaustion and despair, she would sit beside them and remind them why they were there. She would talk about the children she hoped to teach someday, about the future they were fighting to create. She helped train new recruits in basic survival skills, taught them how to read maps, how to identify edible plants. Her background and education made her invaluable in ways the leadership hadn't anticipated. She could explain complex tactical concepts in simple terms that everyone could understand. The tension was constant and suffocating. They all knew that somewhere out there, military forces were hunting them. Helicopters would circle overhead for hours, forcing the guerrillas to remain perfectly still under tree cover. Radio communications had to be kept to absolute minimum. At night, when they finally stopped to rest, Walkíria would often be found writing in a small notebook, documenting their experiences. She believed that someday, someone would need to tell this story. By 1973, the Brazilian military had decided that enough was enough. The Araguaia guerrilla had been operating in the jungle for nearly 3 years, and the government could no longer ignore what they saw as a growing threat to national security. What followed was one of the most intensive military operations in Brazilian history, Operation Marajoara, then Operation Sucuri, code names for what would become a systematic hunt through thousands of square miles of Amazon rainforest. The military machine turned its full attention to the Araguaia region, and the peaceful jungle that had once sheltered the guerrillas suddenly became a war zone. Imagine the sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the forest canopy. A mechanical thunder that could be heard for miles. Military helicopters, some carrying troops, others equipped with surveillance equipment, began crisscrossing the sky above the jungle like mechanical vultures searching for prey. On the ground, thousands of soldiers moved through the forest in coordinated sweeps. They came from different branches of the armed forces: Army, Air Force, even Navy personnel trained in jungle warfare. These weren't ordinary conscripts. They were elite units, specially trained for this type of operation. The guerrillas had always known this day would come, but knowing and experiencing are two very different things. Suddenly, their forest sanctuary became a trap. Every clearing could hide soldiers. Every helicopter sound meant potential discovery. Every snapped twig could give away their position. The military strategy was methodical and brutal. They didn't just hunt the guerrillas, they cut off their support networks. Local farmers and river dwellers who had helped the fighters with food and information were arrested, interrogated, sometimes simply disappeared. The army was creating a desert around the guerrillas, isolating them completely. One by one, the guerrilla units began to fall. Some fighters were killed in ambushes when they walked into military traps. Others were captured during raids on their camps. The lucky ones died quickly in firefights. The unlucky ones were taken alive for interrogation. Walkíria and her group found themselves constantly on the move, never able to rest for more than a few hours at a time. The comfortable routines they had established over months and years were shattered. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. Food became even scarcer, as they couldn't risk approaching their usual supply sources. The forest that had once protected them now seemed to conspire against them. Every bird call could mask the sound of approaching soldiers. Every rustling leaf could hide an enemy. The psychological pressure was unbearable, and some fighters began to crack under the strain. But through it all, Walkíria remained steady, a calm presence in the growing chaos, still believing that somehow their cause would survive this terrible siege. The last confirmed sighting of Walkíria Afonso Costa was during the final military offensive in late 1973. Fellow guerrilla fighter José Genuino would later recall seeing her during what would become one of the final confrontations between the remaining guerrillas and military forces in the Araguaia region. By Christmas of 1973, after the last attack of Operation Marajoara, most of the guerrilla fighters had been eliminated, but Walkíria had somehow escaped and disappeared into the jungle. For nearly 10 months, she survived alone in the forest, the last guerrilla fighter still resisting the military dictatorship. Imagine her during those months of solitude. A young woman, barely 28 years old, living like a ghost in the Amazon rainforest. No communication with the outside world. No way of knowing if anyone else had survived. No supplies, except what she could forage from the jungle itself. The military had placed a bounty on her head. Her photograph was distributed to army units throughout the region. She had become their most wanted fugitive, the final prize in their campaign to eliminate the Araguaia guerrilla. Soldiers were offered thousands of cruceros for her capture. But Walkíria had learned the jungle well during her years with the guerrilla movement. She knew which plants were safe to eat, which streams provided clean water, how to move silently through the forest without leaving traces. She had become one with the green world that had once seemed so alien to a university student from Minas Gerais. Then, in October 1974, her luck ran out. Military patrols found her wandering in the forest, barefoot and limping, weakened by months of hunger and isolation. After nearly a year of surviving alone in the Amazon, Walkíria Afonso Costa was finally captured. She was taken to the military base in Zambioa, where her fate was sealed. On October 25, 1974, according to documents discovered decades later, she was executed. The defeat of the guerrilla movement was complete with her death. She was the last guerrilla fighter to be captured and killed. Her family, living hundreds of miles away, had no idea what had happened. No body was ever returned. No death certificate was ever issued. The military would simply state that they had no information about anyone by that name. Walkíria Afonso Costa became more than just a missing person. She became one more name on Brazil's growing list of political disappearances. One more ghost haunting a nation that preferred to forget its darkest chapters. But stories like Walkíria's have a way of refusing to stay buried forever. The silence that followed Walkíria's disappearance wasn't just an absence of information. It was an active, deliberate campaign of erasure. The Brazilian military dictatorship had perfected the art of making people vanish, not just physically, but from history itself. When her family finally realized something was terribly wrong, they began what would become a decades-long odyssey through Brazil's bureaucratic maze. They visited police stations, military offices, government buildings. They filled out forms, made formal requests, wrote letters to officials. The answer was always the same. We have no information about this person. It wasn't just that the authorities claimed ignorance. They actively worked to discourage any investigation. Family members were followed. Their phones were tapped. Some received anonymous threats warning them to stop asking questions. The message was clear. Your daughter, your sister, your friend never existed, and it's dangerous for you to insist otherwise. Walkíria's family would spend years showing her photograph to anyone who would look. Military officials, government bureaucrats, journalists who were brave enough to listen. The photo showed a young woman with bright eyes and a confident smile, someone full of life and hope. But to the regime, she was just another subversive who had gotten what she deserved. The censorship of that era meant that newspapers couldn't report on political disappearances. Television stations couldn't mention them. Radio programs couldn't discuss them. Families were forced to grieve in silence, unable to even speak publicly about their missing loved ones without risking their own safety. During the 70s and 80s, Walkíria's case became part of a much larger tragedy. Hundreds of other families were going through the same nightmare, searching for sons and daughters, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters who had simply vanished. Together, they formed support networks, sharing information and providing comfort to each other. Human rights organizations, operating under constant threat, began documenting these cases. They created lists, collected testimonies, preserved photographs and personal documents. They knew that someday, when the dictatorship ended, Brazil would need to confront what had been done in its name. Walkíria's name appeared on these lists alongside 68 other guerrilla fighters from the Araguaia region. She became more than just a missing student from Minas Gerais. She became a symbol of the regime's brutality, of its willingness to eliminate anyone who dared to dream of a different Brazil. But the families never stopped hoping. They never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for so long. And they were right to hope. Time has a way of loosening even the tightest secrets. By the early 2000s, Brazil had been a democracy for over a decade, and a new generation of leaders began asking uncomfortable questions about the nation's past. The walls of silence that had protected military secrets for 30 years were finally beginning to crack. The turning point came with the creation of the Amnesty Commission in 2001. Followed by the National Truth Commission in 2011. For the first time since the end of the dictatorship, Brazil had official bodies dedicated to investigating what had happened during the years of lead. The families who had spent decades searching for answers suddenly had powerful allies in their quest for truth. In dusty military archives, in forgotten filing cabinets, in basement storage rooms that hadn't been opened for decades, investigators began finding documents that the regime had thought were safely buried forever. Operation reports, prisoner lists, communication records, budget allocations for STICOE, special activities. The paper trail of state terror was still there, waiting to be discovered. What they found was shocking, even for investigators who thought they were prepared for the worst. The military operations in the Araguaia region hadn't just been about capturing guerrilla fighters. They had been about completely erasing any evidence that those fighters had ever existed. Classified documents revealed the true scope of the military's strategy: code-named bodies, secret burial sites, detailed instructions for destroying evidence. The regime hadn't just killed political opponents. They had tried to make them disappear from history itself. Prisoners were executed and buried in unmarked graves. Personal belongings were burned. But some documents survived, and they painted a horrifying picture of systematic brutality. Interrogation reports that detailed torture sessions, medical records showing injuries consistent with severe abuse, transportation logs tracking prisoners who were moved from location to location before finally disappearing forever. Perhaps most significantly, military witnesses began to break their decades of silence. Former soldiers, now elderly men haunted by their memories, started providing testimony about what they had seen and done in the Araguaia jungle. They described summary executions, mass graves, the deliberate mutilation of bodies to prevent identification. One witness confirmed that in the final phase of the operation, 2 women were killed by lethal injections. According to his testimony, they were Walkíria Afonso Costa and Sueli Yumiko Kanayama. He stated that they weren't just killed, they were strangled. The testimonies were consistent and devastating. The Araguaia guerrilla hadn't just been defeated. Its members had been systematically murdered and then erased from official memory. Walkíria's name began appearing in these newly discovered documents, confirming the brutal truth about her final moments. The jungle never returned Walkíria, but decades later, the truth began to emerge. What started as one young teacher's decision to fight for justice had grown into something much larger than anyone could have imagined. Her story had become a symbol of courage that transcended the Amazon forest where she disappeared. In classrooms across Brazil today, students learn about the Araguaia guerrilla and the brave men and women who gave their lives fighting for democracy. Walkíria's name is spoken alongside other heroes of the resistance movement, remembered not just as a victim, but as someone who chose to stand up against oppression when it would have been easier to stay silent. Her former fellow students at the Federal University of Minas Gerais still remember the passionate activist who encouraged them to question the world around them. They speak of her infectious enthusiasm for learning, her belief that education could change lives, and her unwavering conviction that everyone deserved dignity and respect. She taught us that knowledge was power, recalls one former classmate, now a retired professor herself. But more than that, she taught us that with power comes responsibility, the responsibility to use what we know to make the world better. Human rights organizations have honored Walkíria's memory in various ways. Schools have been named after her. Scholarships have been established in her honor for young women pursuing careers in education. Memorial services are held every year on the anniversary of her execution, drawing hundreds of people who never met her, but are inspired by her story. Her family, after decades of searching and grieving, found some measure of peace in knowing that her sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Though they never recovered her remains, they were finally able to hold a proper memorial service, surrounded by friends, fellow activists, and young people who see Walkíria as a role model. The Amazon jungle where she made her final stand has become a place of pilgrimage for those who believe in social justice. Visitors come to walk the trails where she once marched, to see the rivers she crossed, to breathe the same air she breathed during her final months of solitary resistance. Perhaps most importantly, Walkíria's story has inspired a new generation of educators and activists. Young teachers across Brazil cite her as an inspiration, proof that one person's commitment to justice can ripple through time and touch countless lives. The dictatorship tried to erase her from history, but instead, they made her immortal. Walkíria Afonso Costa remains alive in the hearts and minds of everyone who believes that fighting for what's right is always worth the cost, no matter how high that cost might be. She will forever be remembered as Walk, the last guerrilla of Araguaia,